Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. Delighted to see so many of our friends, old and new, here tonight for what will prove to be a fascinating discussion. If your program has not started yet, if there's an arrow at the center of your screen, please press that to start the program if that hasn't happened automatically. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking. I know we're eager to hear our guests speak, but I do have a little bit of housekeeping to do. First of all, welcome to Crowdcast. If you've not been on a Crowdcast before, we've been doing these virtual programs on Crowdcast since last April, and we've done, 60 some, and we've had a lot of fun welcoming all kinds of people from all over the world. So please join us in the chat. I see a number of you are already saying hi. Hi, Nancy Scheffler. Good to see you. Please sign in, tell people where you're from, make some new friends there, and please continue to chat throughout the program. That's one of the benefits of virtual programs. Unlike being with us live in the auditorium, which I hope we'll be doing again very soon, you can talk because people don't appreciate your chatting in the auditorium, but here you can do it freely. So enjoy that. But at the end of our session, Chris and Rand have agreed to do an audience Q&A. If you have a question for either of them, if you would please put that in the Ask a Question section at the bottom center of your screen. That'll make it a lot easier for us to manage that part of the program. So please do that. Also in the chat, you'll see a link that I'll repost. It's way at the top right now because you all have been chatting, but there's an opportunity for you to purchase this book, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, Chris Beha's wonderful new book that we're going to be talking about this evening. Now, we know we're no dummies at the Mark Twain House. We know that you can purchase this book elsewhere. But please know that if you do purchase it through the link that's in the chat, not only do you get a signed copy, but you also get the benefit of knowing that your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum, and that we at the Twain House really deeply appreciate that. So if you can do that, please do. Also in the chat, through this wonderful partnership that we have created with Harper's magazine, Harper's has offered a really good subscription deal that you can read about in the chat. $16.97, I believe it is. Yep, $16.97 for a year of print and online, and that includes the magazine's 170-year archive, which I've had a lot of fun poking around in, and in which you can find articles published by Mark Twain in Harper's way back when. So please take advantage of that while you can. It's very generous and a great perk for those of you who are joining us tonight. One more thing I'd like to point out, and that is that green bar beneath my face that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Things are starting to open up a lot, and that's wonderful. We've started opening for guided house tours again for the past few weekends. We've been sold out and so delighted to welcome people back to Mark Twain's house. But it's been a long year, and we have been for most of last year without our major revenue source, which is that guided house tour. And we've really relied on the generosity of people attending our free public virtual programs to help keep us afloat. And that continues even now as we are opening back up. So if you're able, and I know not everybody's able, but if you are able to share any amount of money with us through clicking that button, I want you to know that on behalf of the staff and the trustees of the Mark Twain House, every penny is appreciated and every penny is put to very good use. So thank you in advance for that support. That's all I'm going to say right now about all of that housekeeping stuff, because I'm eager to introduce you very briefly to our speakers tonight. Many of you know our dear friend, Rand Richards Cooper. He's a New York Times and Commonweal magazine writer and novelist. He lives right here around the corner and has done a lot of wonderful things for the Mark Twain House. And we're really looking forward to him talking with Harper's editor, Christopher Beha, who has been host of several of these programs for us recently. And tonight he's the featured guest talking about his wonderful novel, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. So everyone, please join me in welcoming to the screen Chris Beha and Rand Richards Cooper. Takes a second to get everybody lined up. So hi, Chris.
Hi.
And here comes Rand. Hi, Rand.
Hey, guys.
Welcome, both of you. So I'm looking forward to sitting back and listening to you two chat. And Rand, just call me back on up when it's time to do the Q&A.
Okay. So, Chris, welcome. We're here to talk about your massively enjoyable novel. At least I found it massively enjoyable and also massive. The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, a novel about baseball, ambition, marriage, money, New York City, and I guess the poetry of life versus the math of life. Let's use that as a shorthand. For those of you out there, there are signed copies. There's a link to that. This book is only going to appreciate in value. I'm going to get one and add it to my collection, my special collection of signed firsts. One of the things I love about this book is that it commands and offers a real range of tones from the mirthful and satirical to really the poignant and sympathetic. There's a portrayal of Alzheimer's or Alzheimer's-like condition. And in its closing pages to the elegiac, a sort of really lovely movement of elegy about time and memory. Now, I'm going to assume that most people out here have not read the novel, and I want to keep that in mind as we discuss it. So let me offer a quick précis of the book that will sort of sketch in the plot and put those who haven't read the book on a terrain for the rest of our discussion. The Index of Self-Destructive Acts follows the misadventures of a young man from the provinces, Sam Waxman, who comes to make his name as a writer in New York City. Sam Waxman is a kind of stat head. He's an interesting combination, at least I took it this way, of Thomas Gradgrind from Dickens's Hard Times, who loves facts and only facts, the pedantic schoolmaster, and maybe Nate Silver, a Nate Silver New York Times type. Sam had a baseball forecasting algorithm called Yount. Baseball insiders will laugh at that. It's an acronym that corresponds to the name of a well-known baseball player, Robin Yount. And Waxman also picked every state in the 2008 election, and based on some renown from this success, he's invited to New York to work for a magazine, The Interviewer, writing a data-driven blog called, what's it called, Chris?
Quantified World.
Quantified World, and that's a key to his Weltanschauung, his world view. The story occupies 8 months in the year 2009, so we're in the immediate aftermath of the terrible financial meltdown, and it's built around Sam Waxman's engagement with his chief antagonist in this novel, Frank Doyle. Doyle is a semi-famous 70-year-old columnist for a New York Times-like newspaper that you call the Herald, and he began his career as a baseball writer, then became a political columnist whose views gradually drifted rightward. Frank's career is in shambles after he made a maladroit and arguably racist joke about President Obama while drunk. He was invited up into the broadcast booth at a Mets game where Tim McCarver and Joe Buck asked him some questions, and he made this maladroit comment. And he is soon undone by what you call the, quote, gleeful ferocity of the social media swarm, something that Frank at 70 is not really prepared to encounter. So we have one kind of journalist whose career is rising, and another kind of journalist who's a very different kind, who's falling. The plot of the book takes off when Waxman decides to write a magazine profile of Doyle. And he ends up getting involved in unexpected ways with the Doyle family. And a portrait of the Doyle family is a big part of what you do in the novel, and it's terrific. They include Frank's wife, Kit, who's an investment banker whose company is going down the drain in a Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns-like implosion. Their daughter, Margo, a would-be poet and grad student. Their son, Eddie, who's an Iraq war vet. And Justin, who's Eddie's former schoolmate. He's a black man whom the Doyles sponsored through a sort of ABC program called Bootstrappers, and he has become a huge hedge fund guy and very wealthy. The narrative, and I think this is one of the best things you do, Chris, alternates point of view chapters set from these 7 characters, the 7th one being Waxman's wife, Lucy. And so you get these kind of interwoven stories, but they're also separate. And one of the ways that a kind of dramatic tension is worked out is we have to keep waiting for each story to be pushed down the road a little bit. The time frame covers about a 7-month period from when Waxman makes his very first blog post for Quantified World, and it's about the ravings of a Greenwich Village prophet who has declared that the end of the world is coming on November 1st. So your book occupies the 7 months between that first blog post and November 1st. So we're waiting to see whether the world will end, and before that, what happens to the Waxman and the Doyles. And so those are, and you need to read the novel to find out. But these are all individual fates of interesting characters, and you keep them all in play in a very nimble way. So before we jump into the characters and themes of the novels, I do want to ask you first a question about writing short versus writing long. I think of your book as, I put it at least in a borderline way into the category of doorstop books, big enough to hold the door open. And it joins a very prized company of 3 other large novels that I read in one day. And John Fowles' The Magus, which was about 650 pages. Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections. I ruined a vacation that my wife and I took in Vermont by reading that in one day and not going skiing and not having dinner. And then Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities, and now your book, which I read all day Sunday. I also wondered, like, do women ever write huge novels? Is that like a male pathology? But so I want to ask you a couple of things. First of all, why such a long novel? Did you supersize this from the start, or did it just sort of happen? And then the second part of this question, I'd love you to discuss, both as a reader and a writer, sort of the pleasures and challenges of the big novel versus the small. I love those big novels that I read in a single sitting, but I can also think of really great, really small, taut, condensed novels. And it's an interesting dichotomy literarily, the big novel and the small. So any way you want to talk about that would be great.
Yeah, well, I guess, first of all, thanks for being here with me. Thanks for taking the time to read the book. This question about length is one that I have a lot of thoughts on. So one of the commenters just noted that Middlemarch is not short. Middlemarch is a big model of mine. That is, and all of George Eliot's books, not all of them, but many of them. Daniel Deronda is a very long one as well. Christina Stead's The Man Who Loved Children is a big one by a woman. Jennifer Egan's best book, I think, is the novel Look at Me, which is not just a long book, but is it is similar in certain ways in tone to the earlier Franzen, to Wallace, to the particular like 90s dude long novel. Jennifer Egan's is actually one of the best of those. Muriel Spark, Mandelbaum Gate is her only really long one, and is also her least successful one. But she's the counterpoint. She almost all of her books are around 200 pages, and they're wonderful. And so obviously you don't have to go long to write something important. I happen to have just finished this morning the galley of Franzen's new novel, which is called Crossroads, and is 580 pages. And I think every single one of Franzen's novels is 580 pages, not 579, not 581. They're all 580 pages. And so this is, he spends 5 or 6 years to a decade on a book. And when they come out, they're multi-character, 600-page novels. And that's sort of all he does. He's very, very good at it. This is my 4th book, my 3rd novel. The other 2 are sub 300. So it's not the kind of only mode I work in, but I will say I love really long books. My favorite novels are novels that are worlds that you spend a lot of time in and feel comprehensive while you're in them. I love William Gaddis. I love Proust. I love the long Thomas Mann books, Magic Mountain and Dr. Faustus. So it has been an ambition of mine at some point to write a big one. I should say this isn't 800 pages, and there was a draft of it that was. There was a draft of it that was about half over as long as this is now. So to me, this is somewhere on the long end of the normal range. It's like a little over 500 pages. It's not 1,000. But it is a big book. So I wanted to write a big book eventually. I wanted to see if I could do it. But I also wanted to write a book that provided the kinds of satisfactions that I think big books provide. What I didn't want to write is a book that had a lot of needless stuffing in it, a book that felt like it was trying to be long for its own sake. So my first novel, it was a kind of idea that made sense as a 250-page book. I didn't try and turn it into a 400-page book. And a similar thing for my second. I knew pretty early on, you could imagine a version of this book that doesn't turn into being about the whole Doyle family and doesn't have this plot line about Kit and Justin or Eddie coming back from the war or all this other stuff, and is really about the young man from the provinces, Sam coming to New York and encountering this older journalist who's at the opposite end of the career. And it's just the two of them. And that book isn't 500 pages. But I knew very early on that I didn't want that to be this book. I wanted to try and paint a sort of big canvas portrait of this moment in time within this particular world, which is roughly like the world of New York media and finance and that kind of stuff. So once I knew that I wanted to do that, it's got to be big. Because you just can't fit it all in without making it big. And so very early on, before I started, I knew that this was going to be the big one, or a big one. But not because I felt like I was going to make it big, whether it needed to be or not, but because I knew that the stuff I wanted to do couldn't be done in 250 pages.
What were the 200 pages you got rid of?
It wasn't so much a matter of, there weren't major subplots that got cut out. There were some, but a lot of it was just trimming of fat. One of the things about this book is, which is, I think, is unusual for a novel of this length, is that almost every scene in the book is moving the plot forward in some way.
Right.
There aren't scenes that just sort of act to create atmosphere. There aren't, long, the Recognitions, the William Gaddis book that's like 900 pages that I really love. It has 75-page party scenes that are just like people drunk in Greenwich Village in the 50s, and it's really funny, and you have to enjoy that for its own sake. Otherwise, you're going to hate the book because it's not getting us anywhere. That's what the experience of the book is. This book doesn't have any of that. It has a party scene, but the party scene is doing a whole bunch of work advancing the plot, So right. I had enough event, I had enough plot that I wanted to get through that I could have handled that plot in a sort of loose way. And this could have been a 700-page book. And instead, right. It's actually, I say this, it's about my own work because I don't think it's necessarily a praise of it. It's just a fact. It's a tight 500-page book. It's
right.
It's a 500-page book. Only, exactly 500 pages worth of things happen.
It's only discursive, really, in terms of the proliferation of characters and the stories that they go through. It's not discursive narratively through digressive commentary, and it reads very, very quickly. The reviewer in the New York Times, Benjamin Markovitz, who writes family sagas of a very tightly focused nature. I reviewed his book Christmas in Austin, actually, for the Times. I liked it a lot. He said the scope of this book is part of its achievement. It's the kind of long novel that begins to occupy its own time zone in your life. You keep returning to it, waiting for fresh news. To me, that's the characteristic pleasure and experience of reading these long novels. I love long novels, and that's why I've read several of them in one day. But I'm also interested in very short, tightly focused novels. I think about Desperate Characters by Paula Fox, or the hyper minimalism of early Nicholson Baker novels, which are very, very short and might the plot might take an hour to play out, or William Maxwell's rather enigmatic book, So Long, See You Tomorrow. Those are books you don't really enter into. You don't take a bath in them. You stop and you stand back and you sort of figure out. And it's a much more deliberative process. It almost amounts to a categorically different kind of reading experience from a big novel.
Nichols and Baker, I said, my book is a 500-page book with 500 pages worth of stuff in it. Baker, who I love, writes 150-page books with 5 pages worth of stuff in them. And,
right.
it's The Mezzanine is a novel about a guy taking his lunch break and moving from taking the escalator to the mezzanine of the sort of like office park where he works to go to the food court. And so you actually, by the time you finish it, you feel like you've been in this guy's head for a long time, even though it's a short book, because you are so closely in his head for that period. I mean, it's a great book, but obviously we are doing very different things.
A question about influences. You mentioned a number of novels that you admired. I thought of, as I was reading your book, I actually thought of George Packer's early novel, Central Square. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's full of politics and also prophecy, with an enigmatic prophet at the center of it, and wayward, educated young males who are sort of at loose ends in an urban setting. I also thought strangely of Jane Austen. The scenes with Margo and Sam, where they're jousting about ideas, and it's flirtatious and it's argumentative, and sort of the ideas are put on the table with this personal subtext. But then more than that, and now I'm asking you partly in your capacity as a Harper's guy. I thought about Tom Wolfe. 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago now, in your magazine, he wrote a celebrated essay. You were probably in 4th grade or something, called Stalking the Billion-Footed Beast, an 8,000-word literary manifesto complaining that young writers with serious literary ambitions were no longer interested in what he called big, rich slices of contemporary life. And he looked back to late 19th and early 20th century realists Sinclair Lewis, and further back to Balzac and Zola, for what he called a true and powerful picture of individuals in society. And he clearly viewed modernism as having taken some wrong turns into interiority and psychological states, and what was needed was objectivity and sort of the writer as a recorder, not as a creator. And he was about to jump in with his own big New York City novel, Bonfire of the Vanities, and this was sort of an apologia in advance for his own novel. As a writer, and what he wanted was for writers to go out and like do reporting and do realist novels based on reporting. So I guess, as a writer of this kind of novel and as the editor of Harper's, I assume you probably are almost required to have a take on Wolfe, and I'm guessing that you do. I'm wondering if you can talk about him a little bit vis-a-vis this novel and yourself as a writer, or vis-a-vis the relationship between fiction writing and journalism, and also other writers who particularly have influenced you throughout your fiction writing career.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I don't, to be perfectly honest, I don't think very highly of Wolfe. I don't think particularly highly of that essay as a piece of thinking about literature or as a piece of writing. I don't like his sentences. I find him affected and irritating. I love Balzac. I like Zola a lot less. Wolfe preferred Zola to Balzac. Balzac knew about the worlds he was writing about. And it's really rich in detail, and you can get a social picture of the world that he's writing about just from reading those novels. If you read The Human Comedy, you feel like sort of Second Empire France, that period. He gives you such a full picture, and there's a lot of, that it's not this what Woolf thought of as kind of like effete, poeticizing, sitting in your room kind of stuff. But it's all, first of all, he has a very strong worldview that is very interesting. And secondly, his great achievement is his creation of characters, Balzac. And those characters are created out of his head. He creates these characters and then he places them in this real world. And Balzac's achievement is enormous. He's really, really one of the towering figures of the novel. Zola, who modeled himself on Balzac very much, is a reporter. The characters are much less interesting than Balzac and Zola. So you in a way, you get a richer, if truly what you want is just to know historically what late 19th, early 20th century Paris was like, what it was like to work on the railroads, what it was like to work in the meat market, what it was, and all that stuff, the way that class stuff worked, all that. You probably get it better from Zola because he really was self-consciously a reporter. And Balzac was writing about spheres of society that he basically knew, although he obviously gave you a lot of the detail of it. And Zola would go out in the way that Woolf went out and go report on some area and then bring it back to you. But it's just like there isn't this. They aren't great stories that with great characters in them. They exist to give you this sort of reported sense of life. And so I prefer Balzac, but I also think that Woolf was setting up a false choice because, as you just said, he was getting ready to launch his career as a journalist turned novelist, and so he had to have this sense that the real action was the new journalists, and that they were doing work that novelists ought to do, that they used to do, that they weren't doing anymore. But in fact, the late 20th century major novels that he was sort of dismissing are in fact, rich with a lot of social detail, I think.
Well, as with a lot of the modern art that he dismissed in other venues. But it's true that he really had one great subject, and it was status, and his massive novels are 700-page illustrations of various theses about status. So in that sense, although they're very large, they're also very small at the same time. But I guess I was thinking about among other things,
the typographical crap is just stupid. He's just not an interesting. I mean, he just like 5 lines of just like PFFFFFF in order to show like air going out of a balloon. You know what I mean? He's sort of amateurish, I think. I don't know. I think he's one of the truly overrated, to the extent that that some people rate him highly overrated writers.
Do you feel that way as about his journalism too?
Yeah, I think I'm not a huge fan of his journalism either, to be honest. I know that that's like the more kind of acceptable opinion, is to acknowledge the fact that he's a sub-literary novelist, but he was a great journalist. But I don't. I'm not really a fan of the journalism either.
I'm a big fan. Now, I'm not a fan of the politics behind them, although there's a murkiness about what's satire and what's celebration in him. But I am a very big fan of his journalism, not a big fan of his fiction. But we can talk about that, I think, ad infinitum some other time. Let's go into a couple of your 2 main characters, whom I set up at the beginning, Waxworth and Doyle, and what your interest in them was and how you're using them. There's an interesting inversion in this novel. The grad grinds, who are obsessed by facts and numbers, are the young people, and the poets are the grizzled elders. Waxworth is smart, but in a plodding and methodical way, he's think you set him up as sort of an avatar of the age of the algorithm. He has a bloodless decision-making apparatus that he applies to everything. And you play that for comic effect. The funniest parts of your novel really have to do with the errant nature of Waxworth's way of valuing things, whether he's searching for an apartment or deciding on marriage. He views picking a mate as a straightforward, optimal stopping exercise, or sort of applied. It's like the Daniel Kahneman approach to romance, or it's heuristics applied to romance, and or less comically, when he takes a position on the Iraq War, he really sounds sort of like the Robert McNamara of journalists. And the novel begins with a small and comical correction to his way of deciding things. When he thinks he's moving from the Midwest, he thinks he has the best value apartment anywhere in New York City, and it turns out it's so cheap because it's next to a chicken, it's not chicken processing plant.
Processing plant, yeah, it is.
And so it stinks. So it's a moment of comic brio to have his algorithmic approach to living his life really upended by chicken shit. And Frank is sort of, on the other hand, the avatar of analog. And analog in this kind of construal in the novel is, I suppose, I don't know, poetry or something. But Frank's up for his own corrections, as well. I wonder if you want to take this from here and talk about these two characters, how you came to write about them, and what you were after in posing them as both dramatic and philosophical antagonists. There's a lot of wonky stuff about baseball at the core of this novel, but you're extrapolating a lot from that, and you're using these guys to extrapolate from arguments about how to understand baseball to something larger. And I wonder if you would talk about these two characters, why you chose them, what you see in them, and what you're using this core thing about baseball to get at.
Yeah, so one of the things is I don't mean simply to sort of like take these two worldviews and put them in competition with each other and see sort of which one wins. One of the preoccupations, I'd say, of the novel is the extent to which we even can live according to a worldview. Sam has this idea that you can sort of manage the risk of life by doing these careful cost-benefit analyses and sort of using game theory to work out all the choices in your life. But the part of the point of the novel is you can't actually outsource living your life that way to some algorithm. And indeed, the biggest mistakes Sam makes are in fact not mistakes like the one about moving in above the chicken plant, where it has been a sort of, what the programmers call garbage in, garbage out. He inserted some bad data into his algorithm. It's the times where he acts impulsively and doesn't, or his body won't do what his mind thinks it should do, or it's the times where he believes he knows what the rational thing to do is, and for some reason that is poorly understood even by Sam himself, he is incapable of acting in that way. So it's not simply that he's got the wrong worldview. I think it's more that you cannot develop some worldview that is then going to answer all of the questions for you that life presents. There's a long tradition of these kinds of characters who are. A lot of the comedy of Saul Bellows novels, for example, are intellectual characters who do a lot of really stupid things. Characters who can tell you all about what Hegel says about ethics, but can't keep their marriage straight. That sort of stuff. And so that, to me, this is not. I wouldn't strictly describe this as a comic novel, but it's one of the things that it is doing is there is comedy in it. And to me, one of the the great drivers of comedy is the gap between a character's expectations for the world or a character's sense of how the world is and reality. And there is a wide gap between between Frank's view and reality too. There's a wide gap between Kit's view and reality. They're all, that's not just Sam, but it seems particularly acute in Sam's case because he really feels that he has or ought to have kind of mastered that problem because he thinks of himself as the empiricist.
That gap in Sam's view of the world leads him into different kinds of problems than the gap in Frank's view. And I understand what you're saying when you didn't set this up as a sort of win-lose confrontation. But it also seemed to me that, especially given the power of the closing pages of the novel, which really end with a Proustian, I have to say it, evocation of memory. The moments when the deep intuitions of meaning that are at the core of Frank, however tragically, they fail in what he does with his life, they have a power that almost nothing in Sam has. And when something like that does exist in Sam, he either completely doesn't understand it himself, or he tries to extinguish it, or it goes back to, say, an early, memory of his mother and of baseball, that he loved, that shows that there is some core in Sam that he's either trying to flee, ignore, or doesn't understand that connects to. There's this beautiful passage when and this will appeal to all the neo-Luddites among us, when Frank, who's not all that much older than I am, although he's dying, take a little exception there, Chris, but when Frank remembers the sound of tickets at the baseball game being torn, and how disappointing it is in a small but indicative way that it's been replaced by a digital beep. And the argument that they're having is partly an argument about beauty, poetry, and meaning and experience that Sam is constantly trying to break down into the quantifiable, while passionately denying that there's anything more than that. And you even have Frank's daughter Margo kind of running through the same argument with him. It's father and daughter together against the utilitarian quantifier. I don't know. I felt at the end, Frank's view, which is the view of poetry, tragedy, and memory, does win. But maybe that's just me wanting it to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably more sympathetic to that view than to Sam's ultimately. I think it is important. You mentioned this memory. I think one of the huge differences between the two of them is the sort of uses to which they put the past, if you can put it that way. Sam has a very sort of instrumentalist idea about the past. The past is where you gather the data that is going to tell you about the future. But all meaning resides in the future, in the sense that the way you test the truth of your beliefs is through predictions, and then seeing whether those predictions come true. So that's where you find meaning. Meaning is embedded in the future. For Frank, meaning is embedded in the past. He's constantly he's nostalgic. He's constantly referring back to the past, not for any particular lessons, but as the place where the real life was, the real thing was, the thing we've lost now, where the place, the root of things. And neither of those taken to their extremes are obviously like proper views of the world. There's another view that would just say that meaning is in the present, is in what we're actually going through in any given moment, and then there's probably some way of divvying those all up, so you don't become completely amnesiac, or you don't become just obsessed with using the past as raw material for getting you into the future, but you also don't become so stuck in the past that you can't live the life that you're in now.
Right. I probably only have time for one more question. I have about 6 more questions for you, but let me ask this one. I want you to talk a little bit about the picture of journalism in your novel. It's not always a pretty one. It's digital journalism as practiced by new arrivals in New York City. There's a great passage where Blakeman, who is Waxman's boss, cautions him, not to don't try to be a writer. He says, 3/4 of our readers can't tell the difference between good writing and bad writing, and the rest actively prefer bad prose. I wonder, it's just a 2-part question. Can you give your readers a look at sort of what you're lampooning by way of what some journalism has become in what you call the digital churn? And then I guess my question is it really that bad? I mean, you're the editor of a pretty top of the food chain magazine like Harper. Sometimes I look at the overall journalism scene and it seems like it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. So I don't know, speak both as a writer of this novel, but also as someone who's been involved in New York journalism for some time.
Yeah, so there are various things in the book that have some real world analogs. And one of the real world analogs here is the interviewer, the magazine where Sam comes to work, has been bought by a social media billionaire or 100 millionaire, depending on who you ask, who has taken this long-standing legacy publication and tried to figure out a way to make it a kind of profitable new media brand. All that has a lot of similarities to what happened when Chris Hughes bought the New Republic. And that eventually blew up in his face, and he sold it. None of it is based on Harper's at all. Harper's, people who know the magazine will know, is the opposite of being in the digital churn, the daily churn. We put out a monthly magazine, and that's pretty much all we do. We're nobody is doing verticals of any kind with Harper's, and no one is putting out 2 posts a day and all of that. But when I started in journalism, and I'd say I was in what you call literary journalism, just as a descriptive term, not as an honorific, meaning it wasn't people doing like a lot of hard reporting. It was people who wanted to be writers. It was people their ambition was not to be like Bob Woodward. Their ambition was to be Joan Didion. You know what I mean? So they wanted to report, but they wanted to write beautiful stuff that was sort of lasting and permanent. What they weren't about was like getting a scoop, uncovering something. That work of the hard journalism, reportorial work. I think we remain, as far as that kind of work, which is extremely socially important. We're still in a good place on that. I think a lot of that still happens, and a lot of it happens online, and a lot of it has been improved by the ability to publish stuff quickly, and by the general leveling that happens from the internet, the fact that you don't have these various gatekeepers into who gets to do this stuff, and the fact that you don't have always, editors who maybe are friendly with the powerful people controlling what gets published. So I think that I get, if when you say there's a lot of things that are great about the current world of journalism, I think that piece we're in a pretty good place. The people who sort of went into it with ambitions to create sort of lasting works of like meaningful literature that happen to have been built out of facts rather than fiction, and that happened to be sort of reported, that wanted to write the sort of the great like new journalistic type literary essays. A lot of those people wound up writing takes for various, online only publications in a way that I think was really socially pretty destructive. And not good for them, and they didn't like it. It wasn't, and there's that element too. I just saw, I wouldn't say, the best minds of my generation destroyed by Gawker, but I saw a lot of people who were really ambitious and talented, and ambitious in the right way in terms of the kinds of work they wanted to do, in terms of caring about quality, had their ambition funneled into the most destructive behavior. And at a certain point, you lose the thing that made you want to do this thing in the first place. And that, in Sam's case, he doesn't have that, especially, it's not about that ambition. His ambition is just to be ambitious,
to be great.
To be great. But there's certainly people who I know who, like, that's what happened during this period of time that I'm writing about in the book.
Well, your book is haunted by the prospect of unfulfillment, professional artistic writing unfulfillment. Margo wants to be a poet, but she's not doing it. Frank wants to be more than a columnist. He has this great book out there, but decades have gone by. Sam, should be writing, but he's actually just, copying his own earlier work and plagiarizing. And so it suggests that the ranks of young people who go to New York and try to write, that there are a lot of casualties, and part of it.
And say that if you read Balzac, you'll see that in Lost Illusions. If you read Maupassant, you'll see that in Bellamy.
You read Dreiser. I mean,
if you read Dreiser, all of these. So that is part of why I call the first section "The Young Man from the Provinces" in this kind of knowing way. Is there is a tendency always to sort of we have a kind of presentism or a sense of exceptionalism about the present, that there's all these unprecedented things happening. But in fact, this is, why it's good to be a little more like Frank and study history and read the old literature, is you realize
quote poetry.
Yes.
Last question is very short. I know we have to get to questions. What's the big novel about New York City that Lucy keeps not reading?
I did not have, to be honest, a particular novel in mind. I actually, in this kind of Ouroboros sort of way, that novel was kind of supposed to be this novel. Was supposed to be. There's just for our audience's gratification, there's this running joke, more or less, that when Lucy, who's Sam's wife, comes to New York, as she's moving to New York, her mother, she's from Madison. She's from this university family. They're very, Midwestern university town liberals, and obviously, educated and living the life of the mind within this context. And they do sort of the thing that those kinds of parents would do for their daughter who's moving to New York, which is they buy her the big new literary novel that's set in New York. And then she kind of reads the first few pages on the plane, and then she's lugging it around in her bag, and it's big and it's hardcover, and she's lugging it around in her bag on the subway every day, but never reading it, etc. So it's not, that one isn't some other novel that I'm kind of in a Romana Clay way calling out. I actually sort of thought that would be the novel that we're reading.
And with you as a baseball fan, are you a stat head or a poet or both?
I'm kind of both. I mean, that's why I was sort of saying about, like, not that this being not simply about putting these worldviews in competition with each other. If I simply, thought that statistical analysis ruined the beauty of the game, and it studied the thing by first killing it and pinning it down on the page, blah 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 blah, then I wouldn't want to write a novel to prove that point. You can write an essay, or what made it interesting to put these characters in contact with each other is that I thought both of them had cases to be made. I growing up, my twin brother and I, the book is dedicated to him. We were really obsessed with the Yankees teams from the 50s in particular, because we grew up at a time in the late 80s, early 90s, when the Yankees had one of their few periods of truly sustained mediocrity. They were really bad teams. And so, but they had so much history, So we love the history of the game in a way that is very much in that Frank mode. We romanticized it. It was this lost thing that we were, Yankees fans in the era when they weren't. And that we had not seen, Mickey and Yogi and Whitey. But at the same time, we were really interested in the stats stuff, and our favorite book was the Baseball Encyclopedia, which is just pure statistics. And we just go and look players up and see, like how many doubles Ducky Medwick hit in 1934 or whatever.
Chris, thank you. I know people want to ask questions. So Jennifer, do you want to jump in and give Chris some questions?
Do I ever? My goodness, you two are so smart. That was just so much fun to sit back and listen to you talk about literature. It's a real privilege to be privy to that. And Rand, I want to thank you for your very close and thoughtful reading of this book. And you really, really did a great job of doing your job. And yes, so thank you. And I kept thinking that Mark Twain would really enjoy having you two hang out in the billiards room and chatting about all these things. So hopefully you'll be able to come together and hang out sometime and continue this conversation. We do have one audience question, but I'm going to invoke host privileges and ask a question of my own. Because, Chris, I know you have kids and you have a day job and you've written a 500-page novel. How? What is your writing routine? How do you manage? When do you write?
Yeah, so the routine changes over time. Most of this book was written before either of my kids were born. I wouldn't say, as it turned out, it was something like taking a leave from Harper's at the time. I left the magazine to finish the book, and then after it was over, I came back. So the answer now, I have two kids and this job, and the answer to the question, how do you write, is I don't. But that's still getting sorted out. I've got another book I'm supposed to be writing, and occasionally some thinking about it happens. But my routine pre-children was I got up pretty early in the morning, not as early as I get up now, but I got up early in the morning without anyone else being up, and I wrote for a couple of hours before going into the office. I'm a big believer in doing whatever works, and lots of people, including me right now, do not have the privilege of several uninterrupted hours first thing in the morning. If you've got them, however, I am a big believer in writing first thing in the morning. I just, you do it and then it's done. Yeah, and then you can spend the rest of your day having things be grist for the mill. But I think I think there's ideally, you get up, you sit down at the page. I write longhand in notebooks, and you don't look at your phone before you do it. You don't check your email on the computer before you do it. You don't get into that mind frame. What you do is you sit down when you're still kind of a little bit close to dream world and in this liminal state, and you write. And you do it every day so that you're in the world, so you don't have to do that getting yourself back into it. You kind of wake up in the morning and you know exactly where you were when you left off because it was just yesterday, and you write. And that happens in the morning, and then at some time later in the day, I try and type up my day's writing. And that you can do at the end of the day when you're tired and don't have a lot of attention. You can do well, someone else is watching TV in the same room, you can do with your kids running around, because that is just transcription work. But the sort of generative writing work that happens kind of first thing in that way. That's the ideal for me. But as I said, I think the real rule is just do whatever works given the realities of the life that you're in.
Well, I appreciate your candor and straightforward response there. And before we do have two questions, but I'm going to just do a follow-up, which is, are you an outliner, or the whole pantser versus planner question?
I'm not an outliner on the page. I don't entirely, when people say they outline on the page, I don't entirely know what they mean. Like, I don't even know what an outline of a novel would look like a novel like this. I take notes sometimes. A lot of stuff happens in my head. But certainly one of the things that I like about waking up first thing and writing, like I said, when you're still in this in-between spot, is you start writing and things happen that you didn't know were going to happen, and then you sort of think through, well, why did I make that happen? Is that something I should keep or not? So very often when I sit down, I have a sense of what scene I'm going to write and what work I want that scene to do, but then all of a sudden you're halfway through the scene and some character behaves in a way that is completely inconsistent with what your needs are for that scene, or some new character who didn't even exist before, and you're halfway through it, your draft shows up, and these sorts of things. And it may be that quickly gets scrubbed, and you realize, like, that's a blind alley, or it may be that you start to say, okay, what's this about? Where is this going? So yeah, but I have never been an outliner.
Again, thank you for your candor. We appreciate that. So thank you for your questions, audience. Let me start with one from Joe, who says, I'm enjoying your book and have two questions. What kinds of New York novels do you like? And what about the city did you really want to describe? Also, the character of Frank seems a lot like Westbrook Pegler, brilliant sports writer turned political columnist and then disgraced. If you did draw inspiration from him, can you say something about Pegler? And if not, please excuse.
So I'll start with the first stuff about New York. The recognitions, which I have already mentioned, by William Gaddis, is a great New York novel. It has parts in various other places, but it's a great New York novel. A number of Don DeLillo's novels are great New York novels. One of them that winds up having a sort of fully kind of American setting, but is Underworld, which has this baseball theme as well. But Underworld is the one where the heart of the book has to do with the Bronx in the 50s, during the period when DeLillo himself was growing up there, and these sort of Italian immigrant enclaves in the Bronx that he grew up in. And it's just wonderful. It's really wonderful. And then this character Nick, who's one of the main characters in the novel, who then winds up living in Arizona, comes back sort of later in life to the neighborhood. And there's some great New York writing in that book. There's obviously, there are a lot of great New York novels. In terms of what I wanted, I mean, I am a lifelong New Yorker, and I was more guided by my own experiences of the city than I was of other books about the city. I wanted. The challenge for any place that is for any novel that is profoundly set in a real place is you want it to feel vivid for people who don't know the place, and also for people who do. You don't want it simply to be full of these sort of markers that are sort of inside jokes in ways that people who don't know the place that it's sort of like shuts them out. So I wanted it to feel like the New York of where I have lived the bulk of my life. And then, sorry, the second half of the question, I have to admit to not knowing Westbrook.
Okay, fair enough.
Frank is largely an invented character. There are obviously a number of these sort of larger than life New York journalist writer types. He's nothing like George Will, who's very like bow tied and tweedy and that sort of stuff. But George Will is one who's a political columnist and also a sports writer. Frank's sort of downfall, which Rand mentioned, it alluded to it's being something we're now familiar with in the world of sort of cancel culture or whatever. Is actually the inspiration for me for that was Don Imus, who made these very offensive comments about the Rutgers women's basketball players and lost his radio show. And Imus was a similar figure in terms of his, Tim Russer was on his show all the time. Al D'Amato was on his show all the time. Various political. He had all these real Washington connections, but he also considered himself a provocateur, and he sort of thought he was sort of a shock jock. He wasn't quite Howard Stern, but he thought kind of testing the lines was part of his job, and he had all these powerful friends who would come on the show, and he thought that insulated him. And then as soon as he crossed the line at a time where it wasn't a climate where you could do that anymore, everybody cut bait. For which I don't blame them. I mean, but it was just an interesting thing to watch happen. So I wanted to have some sense of that, of this guy who's used to being the consummate insider, who finds out when the chips are down that nobody wants to expend the capital on supporting him.
Wow. That hurts. That's powerful. Rand, I'm going to jump in and ask you, do you have a favorite New York novel? I know we've been talking about New York novels all evening, but is there one that you'd single out as your favorite?
Well, this is not really a New York novel, but I would have to say The Great Gatsby would be up there. It's an outside New York novel, but there's the magic of there are the passages when they come into New York City, and those are imbued either with almost a dreamlike surrealism or intimations of violence. They're deeply suggestive, and sort of the mythic nature of New York as a place connecting with the large capacity for dreaming that Americans have is so palpable in the way Fitzgerald surrounds the city in a nimbus of fantasy, and sometimes heat, weather. That's probably my favorite one.
Good answer.
I can recall, I certainly have not returned to this novel in 30 years, but I very much liked Bright Lights, Big City. Chris probably didn't like it, but
I got a real kick out of it. I think it's a lot of fun. And he's
I haven't reread it since
the character is a New Yorker fact checker.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's I am a fan. I haven't liked much of anything else that McInerney has written, but I do like that novel. I also, now that I'm sort of reflecting a little bit, I will mention one of my major sort of foundational influences is Henry James, and he's a lot of his best stuff is about Americans going to Europe, which has its own sort of young man from the provinces element, but he's got a number of great New York novels, Washington Square obviously being among them, and Edith Wharton, another rough contemporary of Twain's, is another great novelist of New York.
Well, somebody, a questioner named Nancy Beha puts in the question section Edith Wharton ? So she was.
That is my mother, and she knows that I am a fan. So it was nice of her to feed me that.
Yes, thanks, Mom. So just one more question, and this is from Carol Wolf saying, wow, can't wait to read this book. Do you perceive an overarching theme of, quote, baseball is the game of life, as in you start out at home and ... So
there's obviously something about baseball that is ripe for the kind of mythologizing that Frank does, because it has been the game that has gotten the most of it. One of the things that I think is a huge thing about baseball is the role that luck plays. You can, hit the ball square on as hard as you possibly can and happen to hit it right at someone. And you can also have, a kind of broken bat looper that, barely clears the infield, be the game-winning hit. There's baseball is, there's 162 games over the season, which is 10 times as many games as there are in football, twice as many games as there are in basketball. Over the course of that season, all of that luck, says the Sam Waxworths of the world, will average out, such that you have an enormous amount of data at the end of the season that sort of gives you a kind of full picture. It allows you to aggregate things, which is also why it is so good for the Sam Waxworth, analytics crowd. But at the same time, on the individual level, for a single game, for a single at-bat, the role of luck is enormous. And that tension is a really, really interesting.
Carol, I would say, was that from Carol Wolf? She's a friend of mine. And her husband, John, my dear friend, is a huge baseball fan. Although when he shifted his allegiance from the Boston Red Sox, our team of childhood, to the Mets simply because he moved to New York in adulthood, it really, really was a great blow against integrity. And I still hold it against him. Now he's in Chicago. Who's he rooting for out there? Chicago? But, the other interesting thing about baseball is George Will. And I thought about George Will with Frank Doyle. I also thought weirdly about Christopher Hitchens, maybe like George Will with a little shot of Christopher Hitchens and maybe some Mike Barnacle in
he's
there.
Hitchens in the going neocon on the Iraq War, obviously, and he's Hitchens on the kind of bon vivant element of it, and basically him being a sort of like high functioning alcoholic.
Right, and a famed conversationalist.
Yeah.
But as George Will has pointed out, all of baseball in terms of batting exists in that little gap between not getting hit 8 times out of 10 and not getting hit 7 times out of 10. And if you get hit 2 times out of 10, you're bad. If you get a hit 3 times out of 10, you're great.
You're in the
you're in the Hall of Fame. And so the amount of failure that is required to embrace if you're a baseball player is a great antidote to a lot of American ideologies that are notably hostile to failure. So there's a way in which that baseball is like at the mythic level a deeply American game, and all the stuff that Bart Giamatti wrote about baseball and its relation to various American myths. But there is this thing, there is this fact of failure, and the American relationship to failure is obvious. There's a great topic, right there. And baseball just seizes on that topic and embodies it in a pretty fascinating and paradoxical way for us. And salutary.
Gaddis, who I keep coming back to, he wrote an essay called "The Race for Second Place," and Dale Carnegie shows up in a lot of his novels, and the thoughts of Dale Carnegie and this American obsession with success. It was very, very interesting to him, and he had this situation where he spent his the first chunk of his life on this book, The Recognitions, which he said, I wouldn't have been surprised when I published it, and he was about 35 when it came out, if they'd given me the Nobel Prize. And in retrospect, I think a lot of people think it deserved it, but what happened at the time was it sunk without a trace. And he basically sort of understood himself as a failure for the rest of his life. But even in that book, there's a lot about failure in it. But his next one, JR, which it took him 20 years to write because he had to spend that time making a living because his first novel had been such a disastrous failure, and he did all this business writing. It's a wonderful study of the theme of failure in a culture like America that's so obsessed with success.
Wow. We are running out of time, and I'm so disappointed to say that because this has just been a fascinating evening. Thank you both so much. I want to remind people to follow the link if you were not inclined to purchase this book before. I cannot imagine that you're not dying to purchase it now. So please go ahead and do that. And Chris has signed book plates for us. So we appreciate your ordering through us. Also, take advantage of this wonderful Harper's subscription offer. I did, and I have to tell you, I just love Harper's, and thank you for doing such a great job of editing it, Chris, because it's a really wonderful addition to my life. And let's do this again soon, and hopefully we'll be able to do it again in person soon. Looking forward to seeing you both again. And thank you to our audience for being here and for your wonderful questions. And thank you for being here, both of you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Rand, for that.
Thank you, Chris, so much.
Great conversation.
Thanks, Jen.
All right, thank you.
Talk to you soon. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.